Nigeria's story is not just about leadership. It's about decisions, economic, political, and social, that shaped over 200 million lives. From independence to today, each leader inherited a system and left behind a different one. But beyond speeches and politics, there is a deeper layer: oil production, inflation, exchange rates, foreign reserves, and government policy. This series breaks down every Nigerian leader through both power and the numbers behind it. Now, a quick note. Economic data, especially before the 1980s, can be limited or vary across sources. So where exact figures are uncertain, we use ranges, historical estimates, and widely accepted research. No myths, no exaggeration, just history, grounded in facts.
In 1960, Nigeria became independent, and at the center of it stood Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, the country's first prime minister. Unlike later presidents, Balewa operated under a parliamentary system where power was shared with regional governments and a ceremonial president. His leadership marked the beginning of modern Nigeria on the global stage. Internationally, Nigeria quickly became active, playing a role in the formation of the Organization of African Unity and aligning itself with neither the West nor the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. But while diplomacy was expanding, the domestic structure was fragile. Nigeria was still deeply divided along regional and ethnic lines, and politics reflected that tension. Economically, Nigeria at independence was still an emerging oil producer. Oil production averaged around 500,000 barrels per day, modest compared to what it would later become. Global oil prices were low, hovering around $2 to $3 per barrel, meaning oil had not yet transformed the economy. The Nigerian currency was strong. In fact, the naira, then tied closely to the British pound, traded at less than 1 naira to $1. Inflation remained relatively low, and external debt was minimal. There were no fuel subsidies as we know them today, and the foreign exchange system was fixed, not market-driven. In simple terms, this was a stable but underdeveloped economy, not yet dependent on oil wealth. But stability on paper did not mean stability in practice. Elections in 1964 and 1965 were heavily disputed, with allegations of rigging and regional favoritism. Political violence began to rise, especially in the Western region.
Critics argue that Balewa's government struggled to manage these tensions effectively, as regional loyalty often outweighed national unity. And while the economy remained stable, the political foundation was beginning to crack. Then, in January 1966, everything changed. A group of young military officers staged Nigeria's first coup. Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa was abducted and later killed. It marked the end of Nigeria's first republic and the beginning of military involvement in politics. At independence, Nigeria had a strong currency, low debt, and rising potential. But within just 6 years, political instability brought it all to a halt. The question is, what happens when the military steps in to fix a fragile democracy? After Nigeria's first coup in January 1966, the country entered unfamiliar territory. For the first time, power was no longer in the hands of elected leaders, but the military. And leading that transition was Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, Nigeria's first military head of state. His rise to power was not through election, but through crisis management, stepping in after the assassination of Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa and the collapse of civilian authority. Ironsi's main objective was clear: restore order, stabilize the country, and prevent further breakdown. But instead of returning quickly to civilian rule, he introduced one of the most controversial policies in Nigeria's history, Decree No. 34.
This decree abolished Nigeria's federal structure and replaced it with a unitary system, centralizing power under the national government. To some, this was a move toward unity, but to others, especially in the northern region, it was seen as a threat to regional autonomy and a step toward domination. Economically, Ironsi's time in power was extremely brief, just about 6 months. So, unlike other regimes, there were no major economic reforms or long-term policy shifts. Oil production remained steady at around 500,000 barrels per day. Global oil prices were still low, roughly $2 to $3 per barrel, meaning oil had not yet become Nigeria's dominant revenue source. The currency remained strong and stable, still operating under a fixed exchange system linked to the British pound. Inflation stayed low, and external debt remained minimal. There were no fuel subsidies, no forex market reforms, and no major fiscal expansion. In economic terms, Nigeria was still operating on the same foundation inherited from independence. But while the economy remained stable, the political atmosphere became increasingly volatile. The January coup was widely perceived, rightly or wrongly, as favoring certain regions, and Ironsi's decision to centralize power only deepened that suspicion. Tensions escalated rapidly, particularly in the north, where resentment grew against both the coup and the new unitary system. Critics argue that Ironsi underestimated how sensitive Nigeria's regional balance truly was. Then, in July 1966, just 6 months into his rule, another coup was launched. This time, it was a counter-coup. Aguiyi-Ironsi was captured and killed. Nigeria had now experienced 2 coups in 1 year, and the fragile unity of the country was beginning to unravel. In less than a year, Nigeria had moved from democracy to military rule to violent counter-coups. The economy remained stable, but the nation itself was no longer steady, and what came next would push Nigeria into its darkest chapter yet.
After the counter-coup of July 1966, Nigeria needed a new leader, and at just 31 years old, General Yakubu Gowon stepped in, becoming one of the youngest heads of state in the world at the time. But this was no ordinary leadership transition. The country was deeply divided, tensions were rising across regions, and Nigeria was heading toward a breaking point. In 1967, that breaking point arrived. The eastern region declared independence, forming the Republic of Biafra, and Nigeria plunged into a brutal civil war. For nearly 3 years, from 1967 to 1970, the country was torn apart by conflict, famine, and mass suffering. Millions were displaced, and countless lives were lost. But in 1970, the war ended, and Gowon made a defining statement. No victor, no vanquished. It was a call for reconciliation and an attempt to rebuild a fractured nation. While the war was devastating, something else was happening at the same time: oil. During Gowon's rule, Nigeria's oil production surged, rising from under 1 million barrels per day to nearly 2 million barrels per day. And globally, oil prices exploded, from around $3 per barrel in the late 1960s to over $12 after the 1973 oil crisis. For the first time, Nigeria was earning serious money from oil. Foreign reserves grew rapidly, driven by rising oil revenues. The currency remained strong, still under a fixed exchange system, with the naira trading at less than 1 to the US dollar. Inflation was relatively controlled in the early years, but began to rise toward the mid-1970s. External debt remained low, as oil income reduced the need for borrowing. There were still no structured fuel subsidies or complex forex systems at this stage. This was Nigeria's first real oil boom, and it changed everything. With rising revenue, the government launched ambitious development plans. New infrastructure projects were introduced,
and public sector spending increased significantly. Nigeria also expanded its role internationally, becoming more influential across Africa. But with rapid wealth came new challenges. Critics argue that despite the oil boom, much of the wealth was not efficiently managed. Large-scale government spending was not always matched with strong institutions. Corruption concerns began to emerge, and long-term economic planning remained weak. Perhaps, most importantly, Gowon delayed the promised return to civilian rule. What was meant to be a transition became an extended military government. Then, in 1975, while Gowon was away on an international trip, the military struck again. A bloodless coup removed him from power. His government had overseen both Nigeria's darkest conflict and its first major oil-driven wealth. Under Gowon, Nigeria survived a civil war and discovered the power of oil. The country now had money, but not yet the systems to manage it, and the next leader would try to fix that fast.
In 1975, Nigeria had oil money, but growing dissatisfaction with how it was being managed. Then came a sudden shift. General Murtala Mohammed seized power in a bloodless coup, removing Yakubu Gowon and promising a new direction. Unlike the slow pace before him, Murtala moved fast, very fast. From the moment he took office, his leadership style was clear, decisive, aggressive, and reform-driven. He launched a widespread anti-corruption purge, removing thousands of public officials accused of inefficiency or misconduct. The civil service was restructured almost overnight, and one of his most lasting decisions was the plan to relocate Nigeria's capital from Lagos to Abuja, a more central and neutral location. It was bold, it was disruptive, and it signaled a break from the past. Economically, Murtala inherited a country at the peak of the oil boom. Oil production remained strong, around 2 million barrels per day, and global oil prices stayed high, roughly between $11 and $13 per barrel. Foreign reserves were strong, supported by massive oil revenues. The naira remained powerful, still trading below 1 naira to the US dollar, under a fixed exchange system. External debt was low, and Nigeria had not yet become dependent on borrowing. Inflation, however, was beginning to rise, partly driven by increased government spending during the oil boom. There were still no structured fuel subsidies as seen in later years, and no market-driven Forex system. In many ways, Nigeria was wealthy, but not yet economically disciplined. But while many praised his boldness, others raised concerns. The speed of his reforms created uncertainty. Thousands lost their jobs suddenly, and due process was sometimes questioned. Critics argue that while his intentions were clear, the execution lacked institutional balance. Nigeria was being reshaped, but very rapidly. Then, in February 1976, just months into his rule, everything came to a sudden stop. Murtala Mohammed was assassinated during an attempted coup in Lagos. His time in power lasted less than a year, but his impact would echo for decades. Murtala Mohammed brought urgency, discipline, and a vision for a new Nigeria. But his story ended before it could fully unfold. The question now was, who would continue his reforms, and would they slow things down or push even further?
After the assassination of Murtala Mohammed in 1976, Nigeria once again faced uncertainty. But this time, power did not fall into chaos. It was handed over to his deputy, General Olusegun Obasanjo. And with that, Obasanjo inherited not just leadership, but a mission to complete the transition to civilian rule. Unlike the rapid and disruptive style of Murtala, Obasanjo took a more structured approach. He continued many of the existing reforms, but focused on stability and execution. The plan to move the capital to Abuja was sustained, government institutions were strengthened, and most importantly, a clear roadmap to democracy was followed. Elections were organized, political parties were allowed, and a new constitution was developed. For the first time since independence, Nigeria was preparing for a full democratic return under military supervision. Economically, Obasanjo inherited the tail end of the oil boom. Oil production remained strong, around 2 to 2.3 million barrels per day, and global oil prices stayed relatively high, between $13 and $15 per barrel. Foreign reserves were still substantial, but early signs of decline had begun to appear as government spending remained high. The naira remained strong, still trading below 1 naira to the US dollar under a fixed exchange system. Inflation was moderate, but rising pressures were beginning to show. External debt started to increase gradually, marking the early stages of Nigeria's future borrowing challenges. Fuel subsidy systems were still not fully institutionalized, but government control over petroleum pricing remained in place. And like previous regimes, the Forex system was still tightly controlled, not market-driven. While Obasanjo is widely credited for guiding Nigeria back to democracy, his government was not without criticism. Some argue that economic discipline was still lacking and that oil wealth was not fully converted into long-term development. Others point to the continued dominance of the military in shaping political outcomes. But compared to what came before, this was a period of relative order and direction. Then, in 1979, something unprecedented happened. Obasanjo handed over power not to another military leader, but to an elected civilian president. It was Nigeria's first peaceful transition from military rule to democracy, and it set a precedent that would be remembered for decades. Nigeria now had democracy again, backed by oil wealth, a strong currency, and growing expectations. But beneath the surface, economic cracks were beginning to form, and the next leader would face a harsh reality. What happens when oil prices fall?
In 1979, Nigeria returned to civilian rule, and for the first time, executive presidential power was introduced. Shehu Shagari became Nigeria's first elected executive president, leading what was called the Second Republic. Expectations were high, oil revenue was strong, and Nigeria believed it was entering a new era of democratic prosperity. Shagari's administration focused on national development with large-scale projects in agriculture, housing, and infrastructure. One of the most notable programs was the Green Revolution, aimed at boosting food production and reducing imports. But at the same time, government spending expanded rapidly. Public sector wages increased, import dependence grew, and the economy became increasingly reliant on oil revenue. At the start of his tenure, oil prices were still relatively high, around $20 to $30 per barrel. Nigeria was producing roughly 2 million barrels per day, making oil the backbone of government revenue. The naira remained strong initially, still under a controlled exchange system, trading below 1 naira to the US dollar in official terms. But that stability would not last. By the early 1980s, global oil prices collapsed, falling sharply to nearly half their previous levels. This triggered a major revenue shock for Nigeria. Foreign reserves began to decline as government spending remained high despite falling income. External debt started to rise significantly, marking one of Nigeria's first major borrowing cycles. Inflation increased sharply, driven by import dependency and currency pressure. The naira began to weaken under economic strain, even though official exchange rates were still controlled. This was the beginning of a structural shift from oil wealth stability to oil dependency vulnerability. Critics argue that Shagari's government failed to adjust quickly enough to the oil price collapse. Public spending remained high while revenue was shrinking. Corruption allegations also increased during this period, and economic management came under heavy criticism. Unemployment and inflation rose, and public dissatisfaction grew. What had started as a hopeful democratic return was now facing economic stress. By 1983, the economic situation had deteriorated significantly. Allegations of electoral malpractice further weakened public trust,
and in December 1983, the military intervened once again. The Second Republic was over, and Nigeria returned to military rule. Shagari's era marked a turning point from oil-fueled optimism to economic vulnerability. Nigeria had learned a hard lesson. When oil prices fall, so does political stability, and what came next would be even more rigid, more controlled, and far more controversial.
In December 1983, the military returned to power once again, and at the center of this new takeover was Major General Muhammadu Buhari, who emerged as Nigeria's new head of state. His government promised one thing above all: discipline, a correction of what was described as corruption, waste, and economic mismanagement in the Second Republic. Buhari introduced one of the most famous national campaigns in Nigerian history, the War Against Indiscipline. It aimed to reshape public behavior, enforce order in institutions, and reduce corruption across government. Public officers were arrested and prosecuted under military tribunals, and strict enforcement became a defining feature of the regime. But alongside discipline came economic restriction. Economically, Nigeria entered a period of austerity. Oil production had declined slightly, averaging around 1.3 to 1.5 million barrels per day. Global oil prices remained relatively high, around $25 to $30 per barrel. But Nigeria's revenue was under pressure due to earlier economic imbalances. The naira was tightly controlled, with the exchange rate fixed in official markets, though black market pressure was beginning to emerge. Inflation remained high, driven by import restrictions and reduced liquidity. External debt was rising as Nigeria increasingly relied on borrowing to finance imports and public spending. This marked the beginning of tighter economic control policies, including import licensing and foreign exchange restrictions. The government prioritized reducing imports in an attempt to conserve foreign exchange. Price controls were introduced on basic goods, and access to foreign currency became highly regulated. While fuel subsidies still existed in practice, the broader economy was moving toward rationing and control. These policies were designed to stabilize the economy, but they also created shortages and market distortions. Critics argue that while Buhari's government succeeded in enforcing discipline, it did so at the cost of civil liberties. Detentions without trial became common, and press freedom was restricted. Economically, import restrictions led to shortages of goods, and informal markets began to expand. Inflation and hardship increased for many households. Supporters viewed it as necessary correction, while critics saw it as overly rigid governance. By 1985, internal tensions within the military leadership grew, and in August of that year, Buhari's government was overthrown in another military coup. His era ended, but his style of economic control would influence future policy debates in Nigeria for decades. Buhari's military government brought strict discipline and tight economic control, but Nigeria's economy was still under pressure, and new thinking was emerging. What if control wasn't the solution, but reform was?
In 1985, another military government took over Nigeria, and at the center of it was General Ibrahim Babangida, a leader who would fundamentally reshape Nigeria's economy. Unlike previous regimes focused on control, Babangida introduced economic liberalization on a large scale. And with it came one of the most controversial policies in Nigerian history, the Structural Adjustment Program, or SAP. SAP was designed to restructure Nigeria's economy. It reduced government control over trade, allowed currency devaluation, and encouraged market-driven reforms. The goal was to stabilize the economy, reduce dependency on oil, and attract foreign investment. But in practice, it changed the economic structure of Nigeria permanently. At the start of this era, oil production remained around 1.8 to 2.3 million barrels per day. Global oil prices were relatively moderate,
averaging around $15 to $20 per barrel. But the biggest shift was not oil, it was currency. The naira, which had been relatively stable for decades, began to devalue sharply. From an official rate of around 1 to 2 naira per dollar, it moved into double digits and eventually into much higher market-driven rates. Inflation rose significantly, often reaching double-digit levels throughout the period. External debt also increased sharply as Nigeria relied on loans to adjust to the new economic structure. This was the beginning of a dual economy, official markets and parallel markets existing side by side. Subsidy systems became more strained during this period, especially as government spending was reduced under austerity reforms. Fuel pricing remained controlled in theory, but market pressures increased over time. Foreign exchange access became highly restricted, leading to the rise of black market exchange rates. For many Nigerians, this period marked rising cost of living and reduced purchasing power. Critics argue that SAP exposed ordinary Nigerians to the full force of global market fluctuations. While intended to strengthen the economy, it led to job losses, inflation, and reduced living standards for many. Supporters, however, argue it was necessary to correct structural imbalances in the economy. This debate remains one of the most contested in Nigerian economic history. But beyond economics, Babangida's era is also defined by politics. In 1993, Nigeria held what is widely regarded as one of its most credible elections, but the result was annulled. This decision triggered widespread political crisis and deepened national instability. It became one of the most defining moments of Nigeria's democratic struggle. Under Babangida, Nigeria moved from a controlled economy to a market-driven system. The naira was devalued, the economy was restructured, and in a historic milestone, the full relocation of Nigeria's capital to Abuja was completed. Power, finance, and geography were all being reshaped at once. But the political consequences were just beginning, and what came next would push Nigeria into one of its most turbulent transitions yet. In 1993, after one of the most controversial political decisions in Nigeria's history, the annulment of a widely recognized election, the country entered a period of uncertainty. To manage the crisis, an interim national government was established, and at its head was Ernest Shonekan, a technocrat, not a career politician. Shonekan's administration was not a traditional government. It was transitional, operating under intense political pressure and lacking full constitutional legitimacy in the eyes of many Nigerians. Its primary goal was stability, not long-term policy reform. Economically, Nigeria was already under strain from years of structural adjustment policies. Oil production remained relatively stable around 2 to 2.3 million barrels per day, with global oil prices averaging between $15 and $20 per barrel. However, the real challenge was not production, it was confidence. The naira continued to weaken, with widening gaps between official and parallel market rates. Inflation remained elevated, reflecting ongoing economic instability. Foreign reserves showed no significant improvement, and external debt pressures persisted. This was an economy waiting for direction, but operating without strong authority. Critics argue that the interim government lacked both the political strength and public trust needed to stabilize the country. Protests and unrest continued, and governance remained uncertain. In reality, Shonekan's administration was constrained from the start, limited in both time and power. Just months after taking office, the interim government came to an abrupt end. In November 1993, General Sani Abacha took control, dissolving the interim structure entirely. Nigeria returned once again to full military rule. Shonekan's tenure was brief, but it represents one of the most uncertain moments in Nigeria's history: a government without full authority, an economy without clear direction, and a nation searching for stability. What followed would be one of the most powerful and controversial regimes Nigeria had ever seen. In 1993, Nigeria once again came under military rule, but this time under one of its most powerful and authoritarian leaders, General Sani Abacha. His government would become known for strict political control and intense centralization of national resources. But economically, this was also a period of unusually high oil earnings. Abacha's administration was highly centralized. Political opposition was heavily restricted, and military authority dominated governance. State institutions were tightly controlled, and decision-making was concentrated at the highest level. International relations were strained during this period as Nigeria faced criticism over governance and human rights. Economically, Nigeria continued to rely heavily on oil exports. Oil production averaged around 2.2 to 2.5 million barrels per day, while global oil prices fluctuated between $15 and $20 per barrel. Despite global volatility, oil revenue remained strong due to production levels. Foreign exchange remained tightly controlled, with official rates significantly different from parallel market rates. Inflation remained relatively moderate compared to later decades, but economic transparency was limited. External debt was actively managed, with portions being repaid or negotiated. One of the most debated aspects of this era was the significant accumulation of foreign reserves in state accounts. Foreign reserves reportedly increased during this period, supported by sustained oil earnings and tight fiscal control. However, the management and transparency of these funds remain widely debated among economists and historians. This makes the Abacha era one of the most analyzed periods in Nigeria's financial history. It highlights a key theme in Nigeria's economic story. High oil income does not always translate to visible public development. Critics argue that while reserves were growing, public welfare did not reflect the scale of national revenue. Infrastructure development remained limited, and economic inequality persisted. The political environment was heavily restricted, with reduced civic freedoms and limited political participation. Supporters, however, argue that fiscal discipline helped stabilize certain aspects of the economy during global uncertainty. But the debate over this era remains unresolved. In 1998, General Sani Abacha died suddenly while still in office. His death marked the end of one of Nigeria's most tightly controlled military regimes, and once again, the country stood at the edge of political transition. Under Abacha, Nigeria experienced strong oil revenues, rising foreign reserves, and strict economic control. But transparency, governance, and public trust remained deeply contested. And after his sudden exit, Nigeria would once again attempt to return to democracy, this time with higher expectations than ever before.
In 1998, following the sudden death of Sani Abacha, Nigeria once again faced a moment of uncertainty. But this time, the transition was different. General Abdulsalami Abubakar assumed leadership with a clear and urgent mission: return Nigeria to civilian rule. Unlike previous military regimes focused on long-term governance, Abdulsalami's administration was transitional. His focus was not on expanding power, but on restoring democratic institutions. Political prisoners were released, bans on political activity were lifted, and preparations for elections began immediately. A new constitution was drafted in record time, setting the foundation for the Fourth Republic. Economically, Nigeria remained an oil-dependent nation. Oil production stayed around 2 million barrels per day, with global prices averaging between $12 and $18 per barrel at the time. Foreign reserves were relatively stable, supported by oil revenue and tighter fiscal control inherited from the previous regime. The naira remained under heavy pressure, operating in a controlled system with growing divergence from parallel market rates. Inflation was moderate but unstable, reflecting years of policy shifts and structural imbalance. External debt remained significant, though discussions around restructuring had already begun. Fuel pricing and subsidy systems were still government-controlled, but increasingly strained by fiscal realities. This was not an era of economic reform, but of preparation for political reset. Critics note that Abdulsalami's tenure was extremely short, leaving little time for deep economic reform. However, most analysts agree that his government achieved its primary goal, a peaceful and relatively smooth transition to civilian rule. In a country with repeated cycles of coups, this moment was significant. In 1999, Nigeria held general elections, and for the first time in decades, power was peacefully transferred to an elected civilian government. This marked the beginning of the Fourth Republic and the longest uninterrupted democratic period in Nigeria's modern history. Abdulsalami Abubakar did not rule for long, but he achieved something rare in Nigeria's political history, a peaceful exit from military governance. And with democracy restored, Nigeria entered a new era, one defined not by coups, but by elected leadership, oil dependency, and economic reform struggles. The modern Nigerian story was about to begin.
In 1999, Nigeria returned fully to civilian rule, and for the first time in decades, military influence stepped back from direct governance. At the center of this new democratic era was Olusegun Obasanjo, now serving as an elected civilian president. His administration inherited a country burdened by debt, weak infrastructure, and unstable economic systems. But it also inherited something else: rising oil revenue and global economic opportunity. Obasanjo's government focused heavily on economic restructuring. One of the most significant achievements was the banking sector consolidation, which strengthened financial institutions and reduced systemic risk. Nigeria also saw the rapid expansion of telecommunications, with GSM licenses transforming communication across the country. For the first time, mobile phones became widely accessible, changing commerce, banking, and daily life. The government also pursued anti-corruption reforms through institutions like the EFCC, aiming to improve transparency in public finance. Economically, this was a period of rising oil influence. Oil production remained strong, around 2.2 to 2.4 million barrels per day, while global oil prices began a long upward trend, reaching $40 to $70 per barrel by the mid-2000s. This surge significantly increased government revenue. Foreign reserves grew steadily, supported by oil exports and debt relief agreements. The naira remained under a managed exchange system, gradually adjusting from around $100 to over $130 per dollar during this period. Inflation remained moderate compared to previous decades, though still present due to structural inefficiencies. External debt was dramatically reduced following Nigeria's historic debt relief deal with the Paris Club in 2005. This marked a major turning point in Nigeria's fiscal position. One of the most significant achievements of this era was the reduction of Nigeria's external debt burden. Billions of dollars were written off, improving Nigeria's credit position globally. Oil revenue during this period also allowed for increased government spending, particularly in infrastructure and public services. However, dependence on oil remained high, meaning economic stability was still closely tied to global oil prices. Despite major reforms, critics argue that corruption remained a challenge and that economic growth did not always translate into equal development outcomes. Regional inequality and infrastructure gaps persisted even during a period of rising national income. Nonetheless, this era is widely seen as one of Nigeria's most economically active democratic periods. Obasanjo's civilian government is often credited with laying the foundation for Nigeria's modern economic structure. Banking reforms, telecom expansion, and debt relief reshaped the country's financial outlook. For the first time in decades, Nigeria was seen as a rising, emerging market economy.
Under Obasanjo's civilian leadership, Nigeria stabilized its democracy, restructured its financial system, and benefited from rising global oil prices. But new challenges were emerging: political transitions, subsidy pressures, and global financial shocks. And as power shifted again, Nigeria's next leader would inherit both opportunity and instability. In 2007, power transitioned from one civilian leader to another, marking Nigeria's first consecutive democratic handover. Musa Yar'Adua became president with a reputation for rule of law and a promise of reform. His administration emphasized transparency, due process, and a more structured approach to governance. But early into his presidency, global and domestic challenges began to unfold. One of the most defining actions of Yar'Adua's government was the Niger Delta Amnesty Program. At the time, militant activity in the oil-producing region had significantly reduced Nigeria's oil output. Pipelines were disrupted, production was unstable, and national revenue was affected. In response, the government offered amnesty to militants, encouraging disarmament in exchange for rehabilitation and reintegration. The result was immediate. Oil production began to recover. At the start of his tenure, global oil prices were at historic highs, reaching over $100 per barrel in 2008. Oil production, however, was initially constrained, averaging around 2 million barrels per day or lower due to unrest. But after the amnesty program, production began to rise again. Then came a major shock: the global financial crisis of 2008. Oil prices crashed sharply, dropping from over $100 to below $40 per barrel within months. This had a direct impact on Nigeria's economy. Foreign reserves declined as government revenue dropped alongside oil prices. The naira came under pressure, weakening from around 120 to 150 naira per dollar. Inflation remained moderate, but economic uncertainty increased. External debt remained relatively low following the previous administration's debt relief, but fiscal pressure began to rise again. Fuel subsidy systems remained in place, continuing to strain government finances during periods of lower revenue. This period highlighted Nigeria's vulnerability to global economic shocks. But beyond economics, Yar'Adua's presidency faced a major internal challenge: his health. Extended medical absences created uncertainty in leadership and decision-making. At times, the country operated without clear executive direction, raising constitutional and political concerns. Despite this, his administration is often credited for prioritizing rule of law and initiating key reforms. In 2010, President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua passed away in office. For the first time in Nigeria's democratic history, power was constitutionally transferred to the vice president. It was a critical test of Nigeria's democratic system, and it held. Yar'Adua's era was defined by reform intentions, global economic shocks, and a major recovery in oil production through amnesty. But his time in office was cut short, leaving unfinished policies and rising expectations. And as power shifted once again, Nigeria would enter a new phase, marked by high oil prices, bold reforms, and growing national challenges. In 2010, following the passing of President Yar'Adua, Goodluck Jonathan assumed office and later won election as Nigeria's president. His leadership came at a time of global opportunity. Oil prices were high, government revenue was strong, and Nigeria was seen as one of Africa's fastest-growing economies. But beneath that growth, structural challenges were building. Jonathan's administration focused on economic modernization and structural reforms. One of the most significant was the privatization of Nigeria's power sector, aimed at improving electricity generation and distribution. The government also introduced policies to expand agriculture, including initiatives to reduce food imports and support local farmers. On paper, the economy was growing, but fiscal pressures were increasing. During this period, oil production averaged around 2 to 2.5 million barrels per day, While global oil prices remained high, often between $80 and $110 per barrel. This generated significant national revenue. The naira remained relatively stable at first, around 150 to 160 per dollar, under a managed exchange rate system. Inflation stayed moderate, but government spending continued to rise. Foreign reserves were strong in the early years, but began to decline toward the end of the administration. External debt remained relatively controlled, though fiscal pressures increased over time. And at the center of the economic debate was fuel subsidy. In 2012, the government attempted to remove fuel subsidies, arguing that the system was costly and unsustainable. But the reaction was immediate. Nationwide protests erupted in what became known as the Occupy Nigeria movement. Citizens pushed back against rising fuel prices and cost of living concerns. The government partially reversed the decision, restoring a significant portion of the subsidy. This moment highlighted a key reality. Economic reform and public acceptance do not always align. Toward the end of Jonathan's presidency, global oil prices began to fall sharply in 2014, from over $100 per barrel to below $50 within months. This significantly reduced government revenue. Foreign reserves declined, the naira came under pressure, and fiscal challenges increased. The economy was still growing, but the foundation was weakening. Critics argue that despite high oil earnings, Nigeria did not build enough economic buffers to withstand external shocks. Issues around governance, security, and resource management became central topics of debate. Supporters, however, point to economic growth, democratic continuity, and sector reforms as key achievements. In 2015, Nigeria experienced another historic moment. An incumbent president lost an election and peacefully handed over power to the opposition. It was a major milestone for democracy in Africa. Under Goodluck Jonathan, Nigeria experienced high oil revenues, ambitious reforms, and intense public debates over subsidy and economic direction. But as oil prices fell and fiscal pressure increased, the country entered a new phase of uncertainty, and the next leader would return with a familiar promise: discipline, control, and economic recovery. In 2015, Nigeria witnessed a historic political shift. A former military ruler returned, this time as a democratically elected president. Muhammadu Buhari came into office with a clear message: fight corruption, improve security, and stabilize the economy. But almost immediately, his administration faced one of the toughest economic environments in modern Nigerian history. Just as Buhari took office, global oil prices collapsed, from over $100 per barrel in 2014 to below $50. For an oil-dependent economy like Nigeria, this was a major shock. Government revenue dropped sharply, and pressure on the economy intensified. Oil production fluctuated throughout this period, averaging between 1.3 and 2 million barrels per day, affected by pipeline disruptions and global factors. The naira, which started around 199 per dollar officially, came under increasing pressure. Instead of fully floating the currency, the government maintained a controlled exchange system, introducing multiple exchange rates for different sectors. Over time, the official rate moved beyond 400 naira per dollar, while the parallel market rate often traded significantly higher. Inflation remained high for much of the period, driven by currency pressure, import dependence, and structural constraints. External debt increased steadily as the government borrowed to fund budgets and infrastructure projects. Foreign reserves fluctuated, rising during oil price recovery periods and falling during downturns. One of the most significant economic burdens during this era was fuel subsidy. Despite global calls for reform, the government maintained subsidy payments for most of the administration. This meant billions of dollars were spent to keep fuel prices artificially low. While this helped stabilize pump prices, it placed heavy pressure on government finances, reducing funds available for infrastructure and development. At times, subsidy costs exceeded revenue gains from oil. This became a central issue in Nigeria's fiscal debate. Buhari's economic approach leaned toward control rather than full liberalization. Foreign exchange access was restricted, import controls were implemented, and certain goods were excluded from official FX markets. These policies were designed to protect local industries and conserve foreign reserves, but they also created market distortions and widened the gap between official and parallel exchange rates. Beyond economics, the period also saw repeated disruptions in the education sector. Universities experienced prolonged strikes, particularly involving the Academic Staff Union of Universities. These interruptions affected academic calendars nationwide and became a recurring issue throughout the administration. Supporters argue that Buhari's government focused on long-term stability, investing in infrastructure, and maintaining social price controls. Critics, however, argue that FX restrictions, subsidy spending, and rising debt limited economic growth and flexibility. The debate over this era remains ongoing, especially regarding whether control helped or delayed necessary reforms. During Buhari's presidency, Nigeria entered recession twice, first in 2016 and again in 2020 during the global pandemic. Each time, the economy eventually recovered, but structural challenges remained. Buhari's civilian era was defined by control of currency, of prices, and of economic direction. But as subsidy costs grew and the gap between official and real market conditions widened, a major question emerged. Should Nigeria continue controlling the system or finally allow it to adjust? The next leader would answer that question immediately.
The first subsidy is gone.
In 2023, Nigeria entered a new phase of leadership, and almost immediately, a new economic direction was announced. Bola Ahmed Tinubu assumed office as president, and within his first days, decisions were made that would reshape the Nigerian economy. Not gradually, but instantly. The first major move, fuel subsidy removal. For decades, Nigeria had spent billions keeping fuel prices artificially low. But in 2023, that system ended. Almost overnight, fuel prices increased significantly. Then came the second major shift, foreign exchange unification. Multiple exchange rates were collapsed into one system, allowing the naira to trade more freely. The result was immediate. The currency depreciated sharply against the dollar. At the start of this administration, oil production averaged around 1.2 to 1.6 million barrels per day, with global oil prices fluctuating between $75 and $90 per barrel. The naira moved from around 460 naira per dollar officially to significantly higher levels in a unified market system. Inflation rose sharply in the early phase, driven by fuel price increases, currency depreciation, and structural adjustments. However, more recent data suggests inflation has begun to ease slightly, though it remains elevated. Foreign reserves have fluctuated, reflecting ongoing adjustments in the FX system. External debt remains high, continuing a trend from previous administrations. But one major shift is clear. Subsidy spending has been significantly reduced. With subsidy removal, the government reduced a major fiscal burden. This freed up resources, at least in theory, for infrastructure, social programs, and economic stabilization. But the immediate cost was felt by citizens through higher transportation, food and energy prices. This is one of the most direct examples in Nigeria's history of reform impact being felt in real time. To address social pressure, new initiatives were introduced. One of them is NEL Fund, a student loan program aimed at expanding access to education. Infrastructure projects have also been emphasized, including major road developments such as the Coastal Highway Initiative. In the education sector, universities have so far experienced fewer prolonged strike disruptions compared to previous years. However, as with all ongoing administrations, long-term outcomes are still developing. Critics argue that the speed of reforms increased the cost of living too quickly, placing pressure on households and small businesses. Supporters, however, argue that these changes were necessary to correct long-standing distortions in fuel pricing and foreign exchange. This debate is still ongoing and will likely define how this era is remembered. Unlike previous leaders, this story is still being written. The long-term impact of subsidy removal, FX liberalization, and fiscal restructuring has not yet been fully determined. What is clear, however, is that the direction of Nigeria's economy has changed rapidly and significantly. From independence to today, Nigeria's leadership has moved through stability, crisis, oil booms, and economic reforms. From a strong currency and low debt to subsidy burdens, FX pressures, and structural adjustments, each leader inherited a system and left behind a different one. Some built, some reformed, and some made decisions that changed everything overnight. But one thing remains constant: Nigeria's story is still evolving, and the next chapter is already being written.